The Roman world failed to revive tragedy. Seneca wrote at least 8 tragedies, mostly adaptations of Greek materials, such as the stories of Oedipus, Hippolytus, and Agamemnon, but with little of the Greek tragic feeling for character and theme. The emphasis is on sensation and rhetoric, tending toward melodrama and bombast. The plays were of interest in this context mainly as the not entirely healthy inspiration for the precursors of Elizabethan tragedy in England. The long hiatus in the history of tragedy between the Greeks and the Elizabethans has been variously explained. In the golden age of Roman literature, roughly from the birth of Virgil in the 70 BCE to the death of Ovid in 17 CE, the Roman poets followed the example of Greek literature, although they produced great lyric and epic verse. Their tragic drama lacked the probing freshness and directness fundamental to tragedy. With the collapse of the Roman world and the invasions of the barbarians came the beginnings of the long, slow development of the Christian Church. Churchmen and philosophers gradually forged a system based on Christian revelation of human nature and destiny. The Mass, with its daily reenactment of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, its music, and its dramatic structure, may have provided something comparable to tragic drama in the lives of the people. With the coming of the Renaissance, the visual arts more and more came to represent the afflictive aspects of life, and the word tragedy again came into currency. Geoffrey Chaucer used the word in Troilus and Cresside, and in the Canterbury Tales. It is applied to a series of stories in the medieval style of De Casibus Virorum Illustrium, meaning the downfalls of the princes. Chaucer used the word to signify little more than the turn of the wheel of fortune, against whose force no meaningful human effort is possible. It remained for the Elizabethans to develop a theatre and a dramatic literature that reinstated the term on a level comparable to that of the Greeks. The long beginning of the Elizabethan popular theatre, like that of the Greek theatre, lay in religious ceremonials, probably in the drama, in the liturgy of the two greatest events in the Christian year, Christmas and Easter. In the early church, exchanges between two groups of choristers or between the choir and a solo voice led to the idea of dialogue, just as it had in the development of Greek tragedy. The parts became increasingly elaborate and costumes were introduced to individualize the characters. Dramatic gestures and actions were a natural development. More and more of the biblical stories were dramatized, much as the material of Homer was used by the Greek tragedians, although piously in this instance, with none of the tragic skepticism of the Greeks. In the course of generations, the popularity of the performances grew to such an extent that to accommodate the crowds, they were moved from inside the church to the porch or square in front of the church. The next step was the secularization of the management of the productions, as the towns and cities took them over. Day long festivals were instituted, involving, as in the Greek theatre, the whole community. Cycles of plays were performed at York, Chester, and other English religious centres, depicting in sequences of short dramatic episodes the whole human story from the fall of Lucifer and the creation to the day of doom. Each play was assigned to an appropriate trade guild. The story of Noah and the ark, for example, went to the shipwrights, which took over complete responsibility for the production. Hundreds of actors and long preparation went into the festivals. These miracle and mystery plays, however crude they may now seem, dealt with the loftiest of subjects in simple but often powerful eloquence. Although the audience must have been a motley throng, it may well have been as involved and concerned as those of the Greek theatre. Once the drama became a part of the secular life of the communities, popular tastes affected its religious orientation. Comic scenes like those involving Noah's nagging wife, a purely secular creation who does not appear in the Bible, became broader. The tragic scenes, anything involving the devil or doomsday, became more and more melodramatic. With the Renaissance came the rediscovery of the Greek and Roman cultures and the consequent development of a worldview that led away from moral and spiritual absolutes and toward an increasingly skeptical individualism. The high poetic spirits of the mid 16th century began to turn the old medieval forms of the miracles and mysteries to new uses and to look at the ancient plays, particularly the lurid tragedies of Seneca, for their models. A bloody play, Gorboduc by Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton, first acted in 1561, is now known as the first formal tragedy in English, though it is far from fulfilling the high offices of the form in tone, characterization, and theme. Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy about 1587 continued the Senecan tradition of the tragedy of blood with somewhat more sophistication than Gorboduc, but even more bloodletting. Elizabethan tragedy never freed itself completely from certain melodramatic aspects of the influence of Seneca. Marlowe and the first Christian tragedy. The first tragedian worthy of the tradition of the Greeks was Christopher Marlowe. Of Marlowe's tragedies, Tamburlaine, Dr. Faustus, The Jew of Malta, and Edward II, the first two are the most famous and most significant. In Tamburlaine, the material was highly melodramatic. The historical figure's popular image was that of the most ruthless of the bloody conquerors. In a verse prologue, when Marlowe invites the audience to view but his picture in this tragic glass, he had in mind little more, perhaps, than the trappings and tone of tragedy, the stately tent of war, which is to be his scene, and the high astounding terms, which will be his rhetoric. But he brought such imaginative vigor and sensitivity to bear that melodrama is transcended in terms reminiscent of high tragedy. Tamburlaine, a Scythian shepherd of the 14th century, becomes the spokesman, curiously enough, for the new world of the Renaissance, iconoclastic, independent, stridently ambitious. Just as the Greek tragedians challenged tradition, Tamburlaine shouts defiance at all the norms, religious and moral, that Marlowe's generation inherited. But Tamburlaine, although he is an iconoclast, is also a poet. No one before him on the stage had talked with such magnificent lyric power as he does, whether it be on the glories of conquest or on the beauties of Xenocrate, his beloved. When still unconquered by any enemy, he sickens and dies. He leaves the feeling that something great, however ruthless, has gone. Here once again is the ambiguity that was so much a part of the Greek tragic imagination, the combination of awe, pity, and fear that Aristotle defined. In Dr. Faustus, the sense of conflict between the tradition and the new Renaissance individualism is much greater. The claims of the revealed Christianity are presented in the orthodox spirit of the morality and mystery plays, but Faustus's yearning for power over space and time are also presented with a sympathy that cannot be denied. Here is modern man, tragic modern man, torn between the faith of tradition and faith in himself. Faustus takes the risk in the end and is bundled off to hell in true mystery play fashion. But the final scene does not convey that justice has been done, even though Faustus admits that his fate is just. Rather, the scene suggests that the transcendent human individual has been caught in the consequences of a dilemma that he might have avoided, but that no imaginative man could have avoided. The sense of the interplay of fate and freedom is not unlike that of Oedipus. The sense of tragic ambiguity is more poignant in Faustus than in Oedipus or Tamerlane, because Faustus is far more introspective than either of the other heroes. The conflict is inner. The battle is for Faustus's soul, a kind of conflict that neither the Greeks nor Tamerlane had to contend with. For this reason, and not because it advocates Christian doctrine, the play has been called the first Christian tragedy. Shakespearean tragedy. Shakespeare was a long time coming to his tragic phase, the 6 or 7 years that produced his 5 greatest tragedies: Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra. These were not the only plays written during those years. Troilus and Cressida may have come about the same time, or as or shortly after Hamlet, All's Well that Ends Well, shortly before or after Othello and Measure for Measure, shortly before King Lear. But the concentration of tragedies is sufficient to distinguish this period from that of the comedies and history plays before and that of the so-called romances afterwards. Although the tragic period cannot entirely be accounted for in terms of biography, social history, or current stage fashions, all of which have been adduced as causes, certain questions should be answered, at least tentatively. What is Shakespeare's major tragic theme and method? How do they relate to classical, medieval, and Renaissance traditions? In attempting to answer these questions, this proviso must be kept in mind: the degree to which he was consciously working in these traditions, consciously shaping his plays on early models, adapting Greek and Roman themes to his own purpose, or following the precepts of Aristotle must always remain conjectural. On the one hand, there is the comment by Ben Jonson that Shakespeare had small Latin and less Greek, and John Milton in La Allegro speaks of him as fancy's child, warbling his native wood notes wild, as if he were unique, a sport of nature. On the other hand, Shakespeare knew Jonson, who knew a great deal of Latin and Greek, and is said to have acted in Jonson's Sejanus in 1603, a very classical play published in 1605, with a learned essay on Aristotle as preface. It can be assumed that Shakespeare knew the tradition. Certainly, the Elizabethan theatre could not have existed without the Greek and Roman prototype. For all of its mixed nature, with comic and melodramatic elements jostling the tragic, the Elizabethan theatre retained some of the high concern, the sense of involvement, and even the ceremonial atmosphere of the Greek theatre. When tragedies were performed, the stage was draped in black. Modern studies have shown that the Elizabethan theatre retained many ties with both the Middle Ages and the tradition of the Greeks. From comedy to tragedy. Shakespeare's earliest and most light-hearted plays reveal a sense of the individual, his innerness, his reality, his difference from every other individual, and at times his plight. Certain stock characters, to be sure, appear in the early comedies. Even Falstaff, that triumphant individual, has a prototype in the braggadocio of Roman comedy, and even Falstaff has his tragic side. As Shakespeare's art developed, his concern for the plight or predicament or dilemma seems to have grown. His earliest history plays, for instance, Henry IV, Parts 1, 2, and 3, are little more than chronicles of great pageant figures, kingship in all its colour and potency. Richard III, which follows them, focuses with an intensity traditionally reserved for the tragic hero on one man and on the sinister forces within and without that bring him to destruction. From kingship, that is, Shakespeare turned to the king, the symbolic individual, the focal man, to whom whole societies look for their values and meanings. Thus, Richard III is almost wholly sinister, though there exists a fascination about him, an all but tragic ambiguity. Although Shakespeare's developing sense of tragic cannot be summed up adequately in any formula, one might hazard the following. He progressed from individual to the early comedies, to the burdened individual, such as Henry IV, Prince Hal, the future Henry V, who manipulates rather than suffers the tragic ambiguities of the world, and finally, in the great tragedies, to, in one critic's phrase, the overburdened individual, Lear being generally regarded as the greatest example. In these latest plays, man is at the limits of his sovereignty as a human being, where everything that he has lived by, stood for, or loved is put to the test. Like Prometheus on the crag, or Oedipus as he learns who he is, or Medea deserted by Jason, the Shakespearean tragic heroes are at the extremities of their natures. Hamlet and Macbeth are thrust to the very edge of sanity. Lear and momentarily Othello are thrust beyond it. In every case, as in the Greek plays, the destructive forces seem to combine inner inadequacies or evils, such as Lear's temper or Macbeth's ambition, with external pressures, such as Lear's tiger daughters, the witches in Macbeth, or Lady Macbeth's importunity. Once the destructive course is set going, these forces operate with the relentlessness the Greeks called Moira of fate. At the height of his powers, Shakespeare revealed a tragic vision that comprehended the totality of possibilities for good and evil, as nearly as the human imagination ever has. His heroes are the vehicles of psychological, societal, and cosmic forces that tend to ennoble and glorify humanity or infect it and destroy it. The logic of tragedy, that possessed him demanded an insistence upon the latter. Initially, his heroes make free choices and are free time after time to turn back, but they move toward their own doom as relentlessly as did Oedipus. The total tragic statement, however, is not limited to the fate of the hero. He is but the center of an action that takes place in a context involving many other characters, each contributing a point of view, a set of values or anti values to the complex dialectic of the play. In Macbeth's demon ridden Scotland, where weird things happen to men and horses turn cannibal, there is the virtuous Malcolm and society survives. Humanity, Hamlet had the trustworthy friend Horatio, and for all the bloodletting that was rotten and was purged in the tragedies, most notably Lear, the Aeschylean notion of knowledge through suffering is powerfully dramatized. It is most obvious in the hero, but it is also shared by the society of which he is the focal figure. The flaw in the hero may be a moral failing or sometimes an excess of virtue. The flaw in society may be the rottenness of the Danish court in Hamlet or the corruption of the Roman world in Antony and Cleopatra. The flaw or fault or dislocation may be in the very universe itself, as dramatized by Lear's raving at the heavens or the ghosts that walk the place or the witches that prophesy. All these faults, Shakespeare seems to be saying, are inevitabilities of the human condition. But they do not spell rejection, nihilism, or despair. The hero may die, but in the words of the novelist E.M. Forster, to describe the redeeming power of tragedy, he has given us life. Such is the precarious balance a tragedian must maintain, the cold, clear vision that sees the evil but not maddened by it, a sense of the good that is equally clear but refuses the blandishments of optimism or sentimentalism. Few have ever sustained the balance for long. Aeschylus tended to slide off to the right, Oedipus to the left, and even Sophocles had his hero transfigured at Colonus. Marlowe's early death should perhaps spare him the criticism his first plays warrant. Shakespeare's last two tragedies, Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra, are close to the edge of a valueless void. The atmosphere of Macbeth is murky with evil. The action moves with almost melodramatic speed from horror to horror. The forces for good really rally at last, but Macbeth himself steadily deteriorates into the most nihilistic of all Shakespeare's tragic heroes, saved in nothing except the sense of a great nature like media gone wrong. Antony and Cleopatra, in its ambiguities and irony, has been considered close to the Euripidean line of bitterness and detachment. Shakespeare himself soon modulated into another mood in his last plays, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. Each is based on a situation that could have been developed into major tragedy had Shakespeare followed out its logic as he had done with earlier plays. For whatever reason, however, he chose not to. The great tragic questions are not pressed. The Tempest, especially for all Prospero's charm and magnanimity, gives a sense of brooding melancholy over the ineradicable evil in humankind, a patient but sad acquiescence. All of these plays end in varying degrees of harmony and reconciliation. Shakespeare willed it so.